Ben sat rocking in the corridor, tears streaming down his eyes, arm clutched tight where it was hurt. He'd been beaten again. This was something he was used to. This happened all the time. Whether he was at home with his uncle, whether he was at school, even the teachers picked him out, and then the rest of the students would get him after class. He didn't really have any friends. He got the mickey taken out of him because aged 13, he still carried a small cuddly toy with him everywhere. It was his only friend. It was the only friend he'd ever really had. It was the one thing he could remember from his mother before he'd been handed over to his uncle when he was 5. The toy was unusual. It was a small, soft toy, but it was kind of like a weird octopus. It had lots of tentacles and a body, but it was close and he could hold it, and he could talk to it, and it gave it something he could call friend. He'd never named it. It seemed like a kind of unnamed thing. No name fitted it, but it was there and it was with him. And try as they might, however hard they had beaten him, however much he had been battered, it was never taken away. After a while, he picked himself up, got his backpack, and began the long, slow walk in the cold home. There was light snow on the ground, and he got the occasional strange look as he was going in nothing but a lightweight shirt with no jacket or anything to cover it. His uncle didn't care. His uncle never spent any money on him. His uncle only spent money on drink and going out. If he was lucky, he could hide before he started drinking, after he'd done his chores, after he'd done the cooking. But more often than not, his uncle would find something to complain about. And then after that, the blows would land. He'd never been allowed to go to hospital. Anything broken had to heal. He'd tried telling his teacher at school out of desperation, but Mr. Tompkin had laughed at him and told him at his age he should just put up and shut up. Shivering, he got home. His arm wasn't quite working right, but he was going to do his best. He went to start on the food. He'd been cooking for a little while when there was a loud slam. Turning suddenly, his arm slightly caught the pan, and the pan slipped and fell, pushing food across the floor. His uncle heard the clatter from the door and came steaming in. He'd obviously been to the pub first. He was already partially drunk and started shouting. Then, as usual, the blows started coming. Hit and kicked, he curled into a ball in the corner, trying to protect himself as much as he could. After the blows had stopped, his uncle looked at him, told him to make him more food, but obviously he wasn't getting any. His was on the floor. Crying, whimpering, bruised, he did what he could and made a basic meal for his uncle. Of course, it wasn't good enough, and more blows came before he crawled out to the shed. and hunkered in the only space he had to sleep, crying slowly. The next day at school, there was a new girl in the class. He'd never seen Lily before, but she looked at him and smiled. He looked around thinking it must have been someone else. No one ever smiled at him. Of course, Mr. Tompkin noticed and singled him out, asking what he was looking at, what he was going. Some of the other children had seen the interaction and started taking the mickey, saying how Lily was new, she didn't know how to avoid the loser. As always, Mr. Tompkin ignored them. Mr. Tompkin always ignored them. At the end of the class, he got up and was surprised to find the girl coming to talk with him. He warned her she should stay away from him. He was bad news. If she was seen with him, she'd get bullied. She might get hurt, but she was having none of it. She turned round and asked him if he was coming to the library. He mentioned about having to be home, having to cook. So she said, well, maybe it was an early leave tomorrow. They could go then. That evening wasn't as bad as all, but was the same as many. He only got a couple of blows before he went to shiver in the cold. The next day, Lily smiled at him again. He was cautious to hide his reaction. He'd been sat there, talking to his toy, all night. Then, when lesson finished, she came straight to him. Jeers came towards her, and she ignored him. They went together to the library, and she told him that maybe they could find a book that would help him. Maybe they could find someone that would help him. That day they were there, he opened his bag and she looked in. He was mortified when she saw the toy. She looked at it and smiled, saying how nice she thought it was and how other people should remember their toys as children. His face flushed a little. No girl had ever paid him any attention before, and he was sure when she'd seen that, that would be the end of it. They went looking through the books, and then the back in a dark section. Lily smiled, pulled one. The cover said it was a book about nature, but she opened it up and it had lots of strange drawings and charts in it. She smiled. The smile wasn't friendly. She looked at him. This will help. We'll get them. We'll look after them for you, Ben. He went home, and that night he had the strangest dreams. Lily's smile in the forefront, the chanting from the bullies, Mr. Tompkin laughing, his uncle bashing his belt into his hand. He didn't know what to make of it. He woke up in a sweat. Hovering over the back of it had been kind of an image of his toy, a great octopus-like being looking down on all of them. And somehow he got a sense of hope from that dark, twisted creature. School that day was the same. Lily wasn't in class, and when he left, the bullies came out and were worse than usual, kicking, beating. He hobbled home. Partway there, Lily came down a side street, seeing him. There were tears streaming down his eyes. She could see the state he was in. He was too scared to go home. He didn't have the ability to defend himself. She smiled, took him to her home, cleaned him up. But he said he couldn't stay. She suggested her mother could help. But no, he had to go. He had to face the music, and he left. That night his dreams were stranger still. There was a squirrel riding a pug, charging with a lance at the bullies as they ran and screamed as it heard it. And still in the background, and the face on the shield of the knight-armoured squirrel was his toy. The dark thing that he dared not name. He awoke in the dark and went into his bag, pulling out the book that he'd found. Going through it, he decided that that day he was going to talk to Lily and see what ideas she had. School lasted forever and they didn't get a chance to talk, but at least she was there again. She was in. At the end of the day, they sat down and he went through, saying he couldn't read the language, but she smiled, went through, found a page, suggesting that page would be the ritual they needed to do. She had what they needed at home, and there was a deserted house nearby that they could use to hold the ritual. She even kissed him on the cheek as she left, which brought a major flush to his cheeks. No one had ever showed him kindness, let alone kissed him. Even what he remembered of his mother had her being distant and strange, with a sinister, scary face. Rather than going home, he headed straight for the house, climbed in through one of the side windows. It was dark and scary in there, but he found one large room that was cleared. He waited patiently. Then Lily came, smiling at him, out of her school uniform, dressed in jeans and a nice top. He couldn't help but smile back. He didn't understand what feelings he was getting, but he liked Lily. She was his first real friend. He just hoped he could keep her. They followed the page in the book as the light went down outside. The house had a strange, dank, musty smell to it, and they could see as the sun went down and light came through the boarded up windows, the motes of dust flickering in strange multicolours across the room. The chalk outline was done. Candles were placed on the point. He started to get nervous, but Lily calmed him down, and they sat at the front of the circle and started to chant. Then suddenly Lily pointed out something was needed. They needed a focus that was bonded to him and trusted. He pulled the only thing he had, his toy, and it went into the middle of the circle. They pulled back and started their chant again, carefully making sure that none of the lines were broken and everything was correct. They held hands as they chanted, occasionally Lily squeezing his hands, and he looked. There was weird signs, weird feelings, The lights got dim and darkness seemed to pull in around them as they chanted more and more. There was no wind, but the candles flickered where they were, almost going out, but just managing to stay alight. Despite this, they continued on, chanting. When they finished, they went back to the start. A strange, eerie glow started to fill the circle. Then, gradually, the colour rose up and started to fill Declan's precious toy. Then, as they finished the final phrase, the toy just seemed to collapse into motes and flutter out into the air. Lily looked at him and smiled, but Ben was devastated. That was all he had, his only possession. She smiled, held his hand, and said, "You've got another friend now. I'm not going anywhere." Ben went home after that. He had dark dreams with noises and a creature like his toy talking to him. And the only thing he could hear in his head is, "Everything comes at a cost." The next day, the bullies and Mr. Tomkin were still at school. But Lily wasn't. He looked round for her, but could see no trace. He decided as he went he needed to go back to the house. Leaving the class first, the bullies, when he got outside into the dark, hounded him. He ran past a dark alley, thinking they were going to catch him, ducked just out of sight. Watching, the bullies paused. Thinking they heard something, they looked down the dark alley. Then gradually, he saw the evil smiles on their faces as one saw a stick on the floor and picked it up, smacking it into his hand. They turned and headed into the alley. Suddenly, there was a brief scream that was cut off, and Ben had to cover his ears for the sounds of ripping, shredding, tearing, the moans, the cries that came from the alley. He couldn't bear it. He huddled into the ball until the noises stopped. It seemed to go forever, with a loud munching and crunching sound at the end. Turning back, he walked down, looked in the alley, scared what he would see. But there was nothing there but the stick lying on the ground. He ran home, waiting for his uncle. He was there. It was late. He was late. His uncle would be angry with him. But his uncle failed to come home. Not knowing what to do, eventually, Ben went to his little bed in the shed. The next day, when he went into school, Mr. Tomkin was gone. They had a new teacher, Mrs. Lee. She introduced herself and smiled kindly at Ben. When some of the other kids made nasty comments, she shut them up and shut them down. There were questions about the 3 missing bullies. And when they asked Mrs. Lee about Mr. Tomkin, she said he hadn't shown up for work that day and no one was quite sure where he'd gone. She asked Ben to stay over at the end of class, and he went up nervously. She asked him if he was okay if he had problems at home. He told her about his uncle. He wondered where Lily was. He needed his friend. But Mrs. Lee didn't know. She said he needed to stay if his uncle hadn't come home, and made a call. Then someone, a social worker, came to see Billy and said she would go home with him because she wanted to speak to his uncle. When they headed back to Billy's house, she was horrified to see what Billy had had to put up with. Then she turned round, smiled at him, said he didn't need to stay there anymore, and took him away. He was housed in temporary housing, a halfway house, while they found him somewhere else. The lady there was nice, but the next day he got up needing to go to school. He needed to speak to Lily. He went, and she still wasn't there. When school ended, he turned and hurried out, heading back now to the old abandoned house. He went in through the window to see where they'd performed the ritual. The circle was still there, but now in the centre there was a soft, cuddly toy. But it wasn't his toy. It was a toy that looked like a little girl. It looked just like Lily. He collapsed onto his knees, picked up the toy, holding it close, and began to cry. He now knew what the cost had been. How was that? Slightly different to the usual fare, but I even got Nutkins in there, Tootie. Nutkins, Knight of Cthulhu. Not certain that's what you had in mind when you first created him. I think I missed your last comment, Legion, sorry. But I got most of what you put in there. I hope you enjoyed it. That's it for today. That was kind of the idea. Who knows? Maybe Ben will show up again. He may not. On his endless quest to try and get Lily back. But all of that said, trying to think if there's anything planned for this Thursday. Probably a stream on Thursday. What I'm looking at doing, I mentioned it briefly, the 3D company I use created a new tool which is designed to create picture storyboards with AI. So I'm thinking about using the Thursday stream to create a framework using that for a story. Great, thanks for that, Legion. And then I can use the images and that framework to build the story on Sunday. That may not happen this week. The tool has only just come out. It's still experimental and currently stalls like every 2 minutes. So it's not in good enough condition today to use for a stream, but it may well be by Thursday. So it's developing all the time. We will see. Anyone that uses Midjourney may have encountered it, and for the life of me its name has just gone out of my head, but it looks quite interesting. So all of that said, farewell for now, and remember, when you get offered an easy way out from your problems, the cost may be far higher than you expect.